Igo. I'm a senior reporter with DevX. Today we're talking about resilience and green growth, moving the needle on climate action post-pandemic. This is part of an event series that DevX is hosting with the CDC group on building resilient economies and societies in the era of COVID-19. Thanks so much for joining us. First and foremost, I hope everyone is safe and healthy, and we're very happy to have you here today. Just a few notes at the outset. I'll sort of set the scene here. We're all trying to figure out what this pandemic means for global efforts to tackle climate change. On the one hand, we're layering an enormous, daunting crisis on top of another enormous, daunting crisis. But on the other hand, COVID-19 is prompting some real rethinks about how to structure economies and societies in ways that keep people safe, healthy, and economically secure. So before the COVID crisis, climate advocates were pushing for a debt moratorium, for example, for low-income countries to help them invest in climate resilience. It seemed like an almost impossible proposal, but now the G20 has endorsed it in response to COVID-19. Climate advocates have pushed for a massive injection of public and private capital to help countries invest in low carbon infrastructure and adapt to climate change. And now we're seeing multilateral development banks put forward hundreds of billions of dollars in response to this crisis. So things that didn't seem possible before are suddenly possible. At the same time, we're in the midst of a pandemic that is threatening lives and entire economies. The World Bank projects an additional 70 to 100 million people will be forced into extreme poverty as a result of this pandemic, reversing years of development progress. And of course, we're already seeing a tragic human toll with nearly 450,000 people dead from COVID-19 so far. So the line between crisis and opportunity feels pretty fraught at the moment. And that's what we're hoping to explore today. More specifically, we've seen some very concrete disruptions of the climate agenda, like the fact that the 26th Conference of Parties to the UN Framework on Climate Change has been delayed for a year. Each of our panelists is actively engaged in trying to move climate action forward at the policy, technical, and community levels. So we're eager to hear from them today about how the experience of this pandemic has affected their work and their outlook on possibilities to invest in communities that are more resilient to shocks going forward. So very quickly, I'll just introduce our panelists here. We have Amar Bhattacharya joining us as a senior fellow at the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution. Amal-Lee Amin is the Climate Change Director of CDC Group. Kumayl Khaleeli is the CEO of Zephyr. And Hindou Oumarou Ibrahim is the president of the Association for Indigenous Women and Peoples of Chad. Thank you all so much for joining us. We also have kind of a special opportunity here to be joined by a live illustrator whose name is Josh. Josh will be following along our conversation, putting it into graphic form so that we can all have some visual representation of what we talked about today. As I said, this is an event hosted in partnership with the CDC group. People can follow the conversation using the hashtags, #ResilientEconomies and #DevXEvent. So we welcome your participation on social media. We want to kick things off with a poll, which we're going to put to our participants here this morning, and we'll use it as sort of an intro into our discussion as well. So if we could get that poll on the screen. A very important question, a very basic question, sort of the framing question of what we're talking about today, I think. Do you think the COVID-19 pandemic will accelerate or inhibit climate action? So we've given you three options here. It will accelerate climate action, it will inhibit climate action, or things will remain more or less unchanged. And I want to use that as a jumping off point into our conversation, because as I said, each of our participants here is trying to move the needle forward on climate action, and doing so at a time when virtually everything about our lives and work has been fundamentally disrupted by this pandemic. So without further ado, Amar, let me turn to you first to sort of frame things up for us a little bit. You've been working at the policy level, you've been working with finance ministers, you've been actively engaged in this space for a long time. How have you experienced this pandemic in your work? Are you finding it something that is motivating new possibilities, or something that's just placing new challenges in the path towards climate action?
Thanks, Michael. So first thing is to recognize that the pandemic is still unfolding. It has hit North Asia, Europe, and North America, but it is only beginning to spread in other parts of the world. And, you know, the focus, of course, right now has been very much on what we call rescue and stabilization, responding to the medical emergency, stabilizing economies, protecting lives and livelihoods. That's been the focus until now. But it's also become very clear that the pandemic has brought out, as you underscored, the dangers and fragilities of the old path. It was very clear that the world was not on a sustainable path even before the pandemic. And that's not just because of climate, but about the environment and planetary boundaries more broadly. But even the growth path itself was not built on sustainable foundations. And one thing that has come out very clearly has been the links between pandemics, nature, and climate. So we can't go back to the old path. And here, as countries turn the corner in getting control of the pandemic, not eliminating it, just getting some control on it, attention is turning now to the second phase, which is recovery. Now, this recovery has to be built on a clear vision of transformation. It's not just a better recovery, it is the goal in the end is to get the transformation we need for a low carbon, climate resilient economy. So that's the goal. So what is the thinking around this right now? And the thinking around this is a recognition that if you actually think about green investments, we find that they have some properties that are actually very favorable in being able to respond to the pandemic. First, many of them can be done relatively fast and relatively safely. When you think about, for example, renewables, which something Kumayl will talk about, they can be done relatively fast, relatively safely. Second, a lot of green investments are job intensive, which is the crying call of the time. And third, they're powerful multipliers, not only economic multipliers, but other kinds of co-benefits, such as reduced congestion, reduced pollution, improvements in quality of life, protecting the ecosystem. So what we find, and there's good evidence of it, is that green investments actually do best in terms of a better recovery. But how do you do that? What are the challenges that we face? And many of my fellow panel members will talk about it, but let me give a framing for that. In order to get a green recovery, we have to do three things. We have to have shovel-ready investments, okay? We have to have investments that are good to go. And unfortunately, most countries, that is not the case. So there's a big task ahead in terms of helping countries to prepare the right kinds of projects and programs that can be brought on stream. The second thing that we will need is these investments have to be anchored in the right policies. Perhaps more than any time in the past, this is the time to focus on the policy distortions around the price of carbon, okay? We do not have carbon pricing in the world at large, and we have in most jurisdictions plentiful of fossil fuel subsidies, which is negative carbon pricing. Taking advantage of the exceptionally low energy prices that we have, this is a good time to get that policy framework right. But it is also the time for smart regulations. You know, when you think about dealing with congestion or pollution, or you think about targets for energy efficiency, this is the time to think about it. And the last challenge is the one that you mentioned, And that's going to be very important for developing countries and emerging markets. And that's the challenge around debt and finance. As a result of the COVID crisis, public balance sheets will be stretched everywhere, everywhere. But they will be particularly stretched in developing countries and emerging markets. Second, the point that you made, which is MDBs, international financial institutions, and other development finance institutions such as CDC are putting a lot of money on the table right now in support of rescue. By the time we reach the recovery phase, at least as far as the MDBs are concerned, they will be out of firepower. Okay, so we should recognize that and recognize that now, that the balance sheets of the international financial institutions also are likely to be stretched. Third, you are right that the G20 has acted on debt. But remember what that action is. It is only a debt moratorium for 1 year for the poorest countries. The debt resolution will require something more fundamental, especially in the poor and vulnerable countries. And so thinking about debt for nature and debt for climate swaps is actually very important, but it has to be a systemic solution. Last, right. I think we have to recognize that we have to keep our eye on the big prize, which is the private sector. And to get the private sector to come in an environment of risk aversion will require much stronger and better risk mitigation. So institutions like the CDC, the MDBs, et cetera, have to focus much more on the power of their guarantees rather than the power of their loans. So my own feeling is that there is an opening in the sense that we have shown that if you do a green recovery, you actually are setting yourself on a path for the better growth opportunity of the 21st century. But it will not be easy. It will require strong collective action, and it will require policymakers to take that long view rather than short view. So that right. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Amar. That's great. You've given us a lot to go on there. And you've given, I think, a direct challenge to Amal-Lee, who I want to hear from next from CDC Group, who's really at the forefront of looking for shovel-ready projects and de-risking and this kind of thing. So Amal-Lee, I want to turn to you on this question, but let's also acknowledge that it looks like we have a relatively optimistic group of participants here, 46% of whom believe the pandemic will accelerate climate action. And that's compared to 33% who believe it will inhibit climate action. So I don't know if you feel similarly, Amal-Lee, but I'd be really interested to hear how CDC is approaching this question, whether you're finding this a moment to pivot or whether it's sort of just a time to keep doing what you were doing before. And let me just also plug very quickly before we keep going that we do want to keep time for Q&A at the end. So I encourage short answers, but also just want to let people know that there's a Q&A chat where they can submit their questions, and we'll try to get to those at the end of the conversation. So Amal-Lee, let me turn to you. How is CDC Group thinking about this moment?
Yeah, well, thank you. It's a great opportunity to have this discussion with such wonderful group of panelists. So I think, of course, we are, as I think Amar said, we are still in the pandemic. We're still in the crisis in our regions. And of course, at the moment, our priority is to preserve our existing portfolio. So to work with our investees to literally just help them get through the current situation. But of course, now we're starting to look at what we're referring to as a strengthen and then the rebuild phase. And I think as we look at particularly in the rebuild phase, but also in the strengthening phase, we do see a lot of potential synergies with elements of our new forthcoming climate strategy. So we will be launching a new climate strategy in a couple of weeks, and that has a very strong focus on, well, three main building blocks. The one is getting to net zero growth, getting to net zero by 2050, and ensuring a growth path towards that. A strong emphasis on a just transition. And I think, you know, if one thing the COVID crisis has really exposed is, you know, the vulnerabilities and very stark inequalities within and across different countries. And so the focus on the socio-economic transition, as we refer to often as a just transition, is a key pillar of our new strategy, and one that I think most countries will be very focused on ensuring coming out of the COVID crisis. And then the third is around adaptation and resilience, to ensure resilience of everything we do, all the investments we make, but also how we can really help to bring forward the types of business solutions and products in our markets, the local businesses that will be needed to help address the adaptation and resiliency issues moving forward, which we know in our region, in Africa and South Asia, countries are particularly vulnerable to various types of climate impacts, already feeling those impacts, and we know more is yet to come. So as we look to implement our climate strategy, we do see a lot of synergies with this Build Back Better agenda. I think, though, as Amar has said, of course, we can't do everything on our own. We work directly with the private sector. So it will be key that in this next phase, that governments, where they are starting to allocate what will probably be very large amounts of public investment over the coming years. I appreciate the huge challenges around the debt refinancing issues. And as Amar pointed out, the G20 has agreed only for just 1 year to suspend those debt repayments. But as the international community responds to support our countries with the challenge of recovering, hopefully those governments will recognize the importance to put in place that this is the opportunity now to put in place the types of policy, regulatory, other incentive mechanisms that will really help their economies grow and recover in a way that is consistent with a sustainable development agenda. I think, you know, as we look at the issues of climate change, is the biggest threat, one of the biggest threats to sustainable development, but also many of the solutions are very consistent with delivering on exactly the issues that Amar highlighted, creating jobs in the short term, as well as importantly, creating the basis for continued jobs and new economic activities over the medium and longer term.
Fantastic. Thank you, Amal-Lee. I want to ask our team to put up our second poll question here, if they could. How can the response to the economic impacts of COVID-19 help strengthen the resilience of communities and businesses to the effects of climate change? Essentially what we've been asking. By integrating more sustainable business models when rebuilding, by highlighting the need for preparedness, not only for pandemics, but also for climate change, or by increasing resilience and adaptation across communities and businesses. So let us know which of those you think is sort of the most promising path. Kumayl, I want to turn to you. You are implementing energy projects out in the world. I think we'd all be curious to know what that is like right now in the middle of a pandemic, and whether you also find that there's, or imagine that there is some opportunity for crossover between these two agendas, which would have some real impact or bearing on the way that you're going about project development. Be curious to hear what it's like to put these projects into the ground.
Thank you, Michael. And I appreciate coming after Amar and Amal-Lee, because I think Amar phrased it up nicely in terms of the ideal situations that we'd have in the developed world, where you see people coming out of the COVID situation, and you see this outlook, this forward-looking outlook. Amal-Lee, I think you you touched on the point correctly in that, yes, in the developed world, you are seeing that positive movement, but in the developing world, we are in the middle of it. And it's been a very disturbing situation in that in Pakistan in particular, the country was locked down until Eid, which was about 3 weeks ago. And around Eid, they opened up the economy because they couldn't sustain the shutdown for economic and social reasons. And in the last 2 to 3 weeks, we've lost team members, we've lost families, we've lost, it's been a very difficult situation on the ground. So the challenges that we see in particular in developing countries is the environment primary for the country or for the economy. And in Pakistan in particular, green is not the topic of conversation. It's how do you have economic growth driven? How do you end up preventing the company from going into stagnation? Michael, you've touched the question in that how do we see renewable energy infrastructure? The challenges, and I was making notes earlier, is that there's a lot of infrastructure that's already been built that's generating transmission distribution infrastructure. And that infrastructure, even though it's on a more expensive basis, has been invested in and loans have been taken and investors have invested funds to try and bring around material change. You're talking about distributed generation, solar, grid stability technologies, battery technologies, etc. Those technologies in the ideal world would be perfect for developing countries which can skip technology, as you saw in people in developing countries which went from 1G to 5G cell phones. We have the capability of doing that, but with regards to renewable energy, you're dealing with a lot of the learning curve, you're dealing with a lot with the regulatory frameworks, but more importantly, you're looking at long-term contracts that have been signed, in particular in Pakistan and other developing countries which have sovereign guarantees assigned to them. So agreed, there's a huge benefit to renewable energy infrastructure. Massive gains can be had with regards to decentralization and application of technologies to island countries and island regions. But I don't think, at least in where I am today, that we will see it really driving economic growth unless driving change, unless there's, and Amal-Lee, you touched on the point perfectly, is that there has to be a linkage with the economic factors which are critical for the economies. You cannot do green unless you haven't addressed the environment, unless you haven't addressed the economic aspect of it, the GDP aspect and the immediate aspect of it, and it has to be material. And it also has to address historical problems that the country is still dealing with.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you, Kumayl. And I do want to return to both Amar and Amal-Lee on some of the points that you raised, because I know that Amar, you're working with finance ministers, engaging their interests and their priorities, and Amal-Lee, obviously, you're working on specific projects and trying to figure out how to make those bankable. But before we get into some of those questions, Hindou, I want to turn to you because you are working at the grassroots and community level. And I think you have your finger on the pulse of what some of the communities that are both highly vulnerable to a pandemic like this, because it has severe consequences for the health and social sectors, but also deeply invested in energy access and finding more sustainable pathways to growth and development. So I would love to hear your perspective on what are the communities that you're representing. What do they want to see on the other side of this pandemic, and what do they hope that the international community and some of these institutions might prioritize in supporting community-led development? Hindu, I think you're still muted.
Okay, thank you very much. Just I'm so happy to be with you, all of you in this panel, and then I hope all of you are doing well, and your family also. Just like from our side as indigenous communities, I just hear today also one of my sister have the husband who contacted the COVID, and then they just like in quarantine in all the communities. So just to tell you how this pandemic of the COVID is increasing and hitting more the most vulnerable, especially as indigenous communities, because we already do not have access to the hospitals as the major communities. And even like when you come to my peoples in Chad, most of us do not have access to the clean water for drinking. So asking them the clean water to wash their hand just to do not contact the pandemic is another issue. So that's why for us, like the pandemic, it's increasing the climate impact in the communities. And when I hear the former panelists who talk about how it is impacting the economy, so for maybe the big economies on developed world where their life is depend from the supermarket, where there is lack of the food in the supermarket, maybe they can have the cash, but they cannot access it. So it's completely different from the developing world. So we're depending from the daily access to the market. You need to go there to exchange your product in order to eat tomorrow. So that's exactly what is happening back home. And when with the lockdown, the market is closed. So the indigenous communities and then other local communities cannot get access to this daily exchange of the products. And then they found themselves in the economic impact, but food insecurity impact. So that's why like after this pandemic, I mean, I'm not sure that we are going to ban the pandemic from the life. Maybe we can see how we can live with the pandemic, I mean, with the virus, but get adapt to live with it. So to do so for us, it's how to understand better in being all in the same level of what is this pandemic, how we contract this pandemic. Because even when we watch from the TV, from the radio in the developed world, we know that like it's changing a lot. They say like when you are coughing, they say no, when you do not breathe, and finally when you do not smile, everything. So at the end of the day, we do not have the same information as the rural communities with the peoples at the developed world. And at the same time, we understand also the developed world do not have all the control of this sickness. Even it's went and then it's coming back in China. So then we say like, how about our peoples back home who do not have the basic information about this one, and who have them life getting impacted every day, and who's seeing again the climate change increasing in the communities. So we doubly impacted. The recovery, green recovery system, so must be open and see in the different way how the world can be invest in this world. Firstly, we are all seeing the billions and billions money that the government want to inject into the economy. And this economy they wanted to inject, they always is staying in the business as usual, how they can save the big industry, how they can save the job, and they're going to invest in a not sustainable life. So that's the worry for us. It's very nice to see that there are billions coming out, but it's more important to see where they are going to invest these billions, to do not do the same mistake, to do not invest in the fossil fuel, to shift it to the renewable energy, because we know that it's working. It is not like we wanted to see if it is work or not. It is working already. So they get this opportunity, they can shift. And secondly, in the health system, when they invest in the health system, they must reduce the inequality, because it is the issue of injustice and inequality for those who do not get access to this very luxurious access to the health. It's really have to be a human right issues that everyone can get access in the same level. And this investment must be in the developed and developing countries. And this what I can call like solidarity, because we all know this world, we all love this world. Solidarity is among people, solidarity among nations. But what is the meaning of the real solidarities for the indigenous communities? Then it's immediately we say, okay, the solidarity, it's like the developed countries just stop the debt for years. But no, our peoples, my peoples, do not contact any debts from anyone, because we didn't saw the color of this money before I get born and then to now. And the debt that we know, the developed countries have the debt vis-a-vis to us, because they use all the industrialization, because they develop themselves and create the climate impact by destroying the nature, the environment. So how they can pay back this debt they have to us who are getting impact. So to pay it, I think they must invest in the right renewable, in the right sustainable, in the right, just recovery. So just a transition recovery. So we do know, all of us, we have 10 years to do so. So 10 years, it's really nothing. And COVID gave us a big opportunity to show we can be the best drivers of our world, and we can change it in the way that we want. If we can decide in 1 month how we can be together and how we can get the green recovery together, so we can show that this green recovery cannot be only for health, it can be for the climate change, it can be for the peoples and running by the peoples. So for now, I think like a person who's coming from indigenous communities and chat like me can say, just we don't want to just talk after this COVID. We wanted an action, and we don't want those action be again limited to the peoples and creating inequality. We wanted the action who can be fair, who can be equitable, who can be inclusive, and who can respect the rights of peoples and the right of the land in order to restore our common good together. Thank you.
Hindou, thank you so much. I think that was a really powerful call to action. And I think you've also, you've put your finger on sort of the central question of this conversation, I think, which is what will be required to ensure that the recovery and all of the associated activity with this pandemic amounts to something transformational as opposed to something that's reinforcing the existing status quo. And I'd like to come back to Amar and Amal-Lee on that question. I mean, Amar, I know you're working closely with governments at the policy level. I'd be curious if you could share any of your sense of how some of the finance ministers that you're in touch with are thinking about this moment. Are they taking that message that citizens want to see transformational change in the way that economies are structured, or are they looking purely for opportunities to, to shore up industries that currently exist in the ways that they currently exist? And then Amal-Lee, I think we'd love to hear how CDC sees opportunities to invest in things like what Hindou is talking about that are getting to those really fundamental needs at the community level, which are frankly difficult to structure in terms of finding the right business model. So, I'm happy for either of you, whoever's most eager to jump in first is great. And let me, before we do that, ask our team to pull up the final poll here, and I'll share the, oh yeah, sorry, go ahead. So the final poll, and I think this kind of gets to the question that I'm asking, is what is the key ingredient to ensuring climate action post-pandemic? Cross-sector collaboration, political will, sufficient funding. And with that, I'll turn to either Amar or Amal-Lee to weigh in on how you see this balance between transformation and sort of status quo recovery playing out in the work that you're doing.
I'm happy to go. So on the evidence to date, Vivid Economics has tabulated the greenness of the stimulus packages so far? And the answer is actually we are doing much more the old rather than anything new. So that's, and it's not surprising, but that's the result. And why is it the case? Because two instruments that are particularly being used in advanced economies are bailout packages, very large bailout packages, and second, quantitative purchases of corporate debt. And in both cases, it's very much buying the old. So that's where we are right now. So and in emerging markets and developing countries, the challenge is they really don't have any space right now. And one of the things that the MDBs are particularly focused on is how do they ensure that they are supporting a green recovery. So in work that we have done, we have enumerated the kinds of indicators that governments can use and that society can use to hold governments to account in terms of the quality of their recovery packages. And it'll be very important that these packages be judged rigorously in terms of these indicators and benchmarks. So we feel it'll be very important for organizations like the CDC to have these criteria that Amal-Lee was saying that ensure that they are supporting a better recovery and a just transition. So I think this idea of having good metrics, good benchmarks, and transparency will be extremely important in this next phase, but with an eye on long-term transformation. And here I want to mention the link between recovery and NDCs, particularly from the perspective of climate. So NDCs provide, in some sense at least, a point in time indication of climate direction and climate ambition. And one of the things that the recovery packages can be judged by is how are they consistent or not consistent with the NDCs. But there's another aspect which is even more important, and that is how can they be used to raise the ambition of the next generation of NDCs. So what we are trying to
nationally determined contributions. I just wanted to, maybe you could, for those who may not be familiar, could you just spell out what they are?
Yeah, so NDCs means nationally defined contributions. This in UNFCCC or in climate negotiations speak is what the countries are committing to in terms of their climate ambition and climate action. And 2020 is a very important year because countries have to now come up with their plans for the next 5 years. So this is a good time to link this, next generation of NDCs with precisely what you were saying, Michael, which is the link between recovery and transformation.
Fantastic.
So,
yes, thanks.
Yeah, just coming back to your question and building on some of the points that Hindou made. So I think, as we look at the challenges moving forward, I mean, Amar's set out very clearly the clear role that governments will need to take if this Build Back Better agenda really does deliver on the opportunities to ensure much more resilient, much cleaner growth over the medium and longer term. And that will require ensuring that those companies that have potential technologies or can potentially provide different services than maybe they have in the past, that we can bring those forward. I mean, CDC, we are, as you rightly say, Michael, we invest in the private sector, but we also work closely with our investees to ensure we bring forward strong development impact from those investments, and including looking at how to bring quality jobs, how to ensure we can address gender inequalities, And then, as we will see now with our new climate strategy, a renewed focus on the delivering on a climate agenda. And I think when we think about it, it's very interesting, I think, some of the points that Hindou made. And, you know, we talk quite a lot about the new technologies, and I think in particular, as Kumayl has emphasized, you know, technologies, renewable energy technologies, we're seeing very rapid declining costs of key technologies such as storage, energy storage. All of these will really help to decarbonize the electricity sector, the power sector. But we also need to recognize that many of the solutions we need are also more, maybe more indigenous, if you like, thinking in particular about the role of nature-based solutions. I mean, this is an area we're really focused on now, how to invest more in the types of activities that are helping to bring forward back, restore natural capital that can, you know, really bring improvement of degraded lands, that can create good sort of local quality jobs, how to improve the value chains if there are, for example, in agriculture or sustainable forestry, you know, how to help ensure that this creates local jobs, local benefits, and, you know, and supports local entrepreneurs in these areas. So very important not to assume everything's going to be a high-tech solution. It is going to be in some cases, and I would like to just emphasize, I think one aspect that we also need to do a lot more on, and create, as I referred to it briefly in my opening comments, we need to also help improve the types of technologies that enable us to better predict ways of becoming more resilient to future climate impacts. I think much of that, and that will require the digitalization, improving connectivity, but much of that can also help bring other benefits, improved awareness around health impacts. I mean, some of the issues that Hindou highlighted, that you know, not having as much information, as much understanding around what's happening at the moment with the COVID pandemic. I mean, we've all been learning as we go in this pandemic, but how do we help improve that, improve the connectivity, which can be both important, both for health, for ensuring that rural communities in particular have better access to maybe remote health services where necessary, but also really help improve resiliency to climate impacts in the future. So I just wanted to bring that, because that is another key area that we hope to do a lot more as we start to implement our climate strategy at CDC Group.
Fantastic. Thank you, Amal-Lee. I'm going to sort of gradually, subtly transition into the audience Q&A here, because we're getting a lot of questions. Many of them touch on things that we've been talking about and that we've had in mind previously. But Kumayl, let me sort of turn to you, and this might be a little bit of a back and forth with Amal-Lee, but I mean, you're working directly with CDC Group, correct? And you have some experience with collaborating with development finance institutions. Any requests? anything that you might point out that these institutions could be doing to more effectively drive investment towards the renewable sector, and to scale up, you know, what we hope is sort of a moment of attention to the critical need for investment in that area?
Michael, thank you for putting me on the spot. I think I should disclose that, and thank you for mentioning CDC is one of our stakeholders. CDC is actually a stakeholder on our equity side and our debt side. And I think it's the first project that CDC has done where you have joint investment. So from a standpoint of a partnership, not only on the financing standpoint, they've been very strong partners with regards to dealing with the environmental issues. Partnerships that go back about, let's say, 4 or 5 years. Amal-Lee, you probably have a bit more. We haven't interacted, but I've spent way too much time in their offices. The benefit that comes from a strong partner that has a local presence, is that it's important to, and Amal-Lee touched on it well, in that you have to redefine what the business model is. The traditional business model of investment, equity contribution, debt contribution doesn't work, in particular in developing countries. There has to be I think the old consulting term was triple bottom line. There has to be some way to redefine the business model such that return is not just IRR based or it's debt payment based, but the social larger impact has to be looked at. The strength coming from a DFI and having them as a partner has served well, because we actually deal with we have mangroves within proximity, and we're based in tidal land. So from a standpoint of having a big brother and being able to point back and say, hey guys, we are doing environmental work here. It's not my responsibility. I have to answer to the board. I have to answer to the shareholders, and I have to answer to rules and regulations that not only coming from a DFI, but also IFC standards. That served really well, and implementation of those standards has actually put us in a stronger position with regards to the overall investment than having tried to circumvent around them. It's made our community relationship stronger, and it's also helped design a better system for the stakeholders. I think there's a bunch more I can say, but I'll leave it.
No, that's great. Thank you, Kumayl. Let me quickly share the results of the last poll, which were pretty decisive. So what's the key ingredient to ensuring climate action post-pandemic? 61% of our respondents said political will, which seems to coincide fairly closely with what I think our panel is pointing to here as well. Just a reminder, please feel free to submit questions to the Q&A chat box. We have a lot already, and I'm gonna dive right into them. And the first one is for Hindou, and that is, how effectively do you feel that quote unquote green initiatives are communicated at the ground level? Do you feel that individual people are being included in the climate change discussion? Or do people feel that it is only a conversation between international organizations?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for the questions. I think, when we talk about the climate change with all the technical word, like the UNFCCC, adaptation, mitigation, or whatever, it seems to be just like the international or intellectual or international organizations, just the institution that talking about climate change. But people on the ground, they are not talking, they're acting. That's what we are really doing, because we do not wait for what is the adaptation mean, or we do not argue like in the negotiation of the climate change around the must or may, or around just wording or full stop or whatever. We do not have this kind of behavior. We acting directly. So when you go like to my community who do not went to school, and many other indigenous communities, but who are living the impact of the climate change every day. So we are just like innovators peoples. We just go to find a water where there is dry area. We go find a food in the forest because we do not have a supermarket where we can feed our communities. And we try to share these resources in our daily basis. And that helps us to just to produce our traditional knowledge to better cope with our environment. So that's why for us, we do not act individually at the communities, we act collectively. And this is the importance of the responding to the climate change. Because climate change do not have a border. We cannot wear a mask or just a lockdown and then fine, we do not be contacted by the climate change. It is not like COVID at all. Climate change do not care about border, do not care about you have mask or you are rich or you are poor. If the rain didn't come, that means you cannot cultivate your farm. That means you cannot put the food in the tables of the peoples who are in the town or in your communities. So it's a series of the channel that can impact everyone. And that's also why it's very important to link the international discussions with the local realities, with what is happening. They cannot decide on them on and come and say, oh, we have a project for climate change for you. That cannot work like that anymore. It's have to be including discussions that the communities can know what they are discussing, and they must understand what the communities are living on in every single season that we have, and that the work politician can take a right decisions, the investor can implement a right project, but they can channel the money to those who are implementing the project, not just talking about money and ending the money in the big conferences or buying a big car to say, oh, I can use this car to go to the community and tell them about climate change. We know the climate change better than the people that who went to school and who negotiate. So changing and then sharing that can help us better implement the climate change inclusively.
Great, thank you. That's definitely a strong call to action for those at the policy level. And I want to turn to you, Amar, to sort of ask about that political level. We've got a couple of questions from people who are wondering, how policymakers might respond to this moment, and if they might take decisions at sort of a rash moment. So with a rush to open up and strengthen economies following the pandemic, do you see a risk for rash decision-making among policymakers in terms of which industries to subsidize and invest heavily into? As a result, increasing chances of pollutant industries gaining access to growth and stimulus packages. And then sort of a similar question on sort of the macroeconomic front. In the event that countries activate austerity measures during the post-COVID economic recovery, do you foresee countries choosing to constrain or spur green economy mechanisms, even if they do activate austerity measures? So, for people who are thinking about these sort of big political economic decisions, what do you think are some of the reasons to be either hopeful or concerned about the various directions they might take?
So I think it's useful to distinguish between three sets of countries. I think the most advanced is Europe. And Europe was fortunate that they had begun to think of the European Green Deal before the COVID pandemic, including thinking about the roadmap for this Green Deal, and including tasking the European Investment Bank to fund that Green Deal. So the European Investment Bank is prepared to fund something like $1 trillion in partnership with the private sector. And Europe has come very clearly through these objectives of green, with a very strong focus on climate, digitalization, recognizing that digitalization will be very important in the post-COVID world, and as Amal-Lee mentioned, the just transition. So that is really what I would call the first in class, okay? Now, in contrast, here in the United States, where we've been having a discussion around stimulus packages, many politicians are insisting that no stimulus should rule out support for fossil fuel industries. So we are in the US in a very, very different position in terms of the political context of the debate, in terms of supporting better investments. In emerging markets and developing countries, as Kumayl pointed out, there's a question of, do they have the luxury, okay? Do they have the means to undertake the kinds of investments that have to, that are greener? And there are 2 points here that are worth emphasizing. There's a perception that green, more resilient investments are more costly investments. And countering that with the evidence and also countering it with the means of finance will be very important. So if I go to a country and I say, look, actually the renewable sector is really the better sector, then the question will be where, do you have the right policy framework, as Kumayl was saying? Do you have, the grid stability measures that need to be taken place? Do you have appropriate feed-in tariffs? Do you have the kind of support in terms of the investments? And do you have the finance that will be needed? Okay. So I think for emerging markets and developing countries, that's where the role of institutions like CDC become absolutely critical. But I would say that we are not in a uniform place with regard to this challenge, about, are policymakers well aligned or not? And my sense is, policymakers were waking up to the climate crisis. COVID has come along. It is now a major distraction for policymakers. I don't think they have fully woken up to the opportunities as yet. That would be my bottom line.
Great, thank you, Amar. Amal-Lee, we have a question about the role of development finance institutions, and I think a question that could be interpreted kind of as a specific challenge to CDC Group. Given the complexities of green recovery, what are some strategies that CDC and other development finance institutions could consider to advance environmental sustainability in their existing portfolios, in addition to making new green investments? And I know you mentioned that there's some strategic thinking going on right now at CDC Group. I'm not sure there's any news that you're able to break for us at the moment, but welcome any thoughts you have on that question.
Thank you. Yes, I think, so as a DFI, as an impact investor, I think, we have, as I said at the beginning, our number one priority has been to work with our existing portfolio companies to ensure that they can get through this crisis. And so as we move out of the initial crisis phase, we will be looking at what other opportunities can help to both get them through the next stage of the recovery, but also align with perhaps a greener, maybe more resource productivity agenda. For example, looking at potential for energy efficiency measures. I think also we will start to increasingly look at other opportunities to help companies also become more resilient to physical impacts. But I think we also need to think about resilience in a much broader sense now coming out of COVID, and there's many different angles to that. I think, as Kumayl said, and it's interesting, so Kumayl, I joined CDC mid-February, so just 4 weeks before lockdown. So you've probably spent more time in our offices than I have, I think. But I think, as Kumayl said, it's that collaboration with our investees is really important. We're not just providing finance. We aim to be a partner, and of course we do have, we comply with the IFC performance standards, and those can do require certain adherence to certain rules. But I think we see that those delivering on those social, environmental, other economic objectives, such as ensuring big job qualities, bringing value add to our investees is what we can bring beyond finance. So I think coming out of this initial crisis phase, we will of course continue to do that with our existing portfolio companies, and then also look how we can really try to shore up confidence in our markets. Our role as one of the first investors back into our markets, as we make new investments, we will be continuing to bring other investors along and to ensure that there is confidence maintained and around the types of business opportunities that we'll need to see. So I think, so I hopefully answered that in two slightly different ways. I think both are equally important in our role as a development finance institute.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. A few of you have mentioned this idea of a just transition, which I know is a phrase that gets thrown around a lot during the climate change negotiations and elsewhere. But basically the notion that, as we're trying to shift economies from fossil intensive infrastructure to low carbon infrastructure, that raises a challenge for the people who work in those industries and for people who are supported by income that comes from those industries. So how do you make that a positive development for the people who are likely to be impacted by it? And Kumayl, I'd be curious to hear from you on this. I mean, you're implementing energy projects. Are you making the case that this is an employment opportunity at the level of the communities where you're working? Is that well received? And Hindou, I have a similar question for you on this, but I'll wait for Kumail's answer. You know, when you're thinking about this on sort of a project basis, what is your impression of the kind of employment opportunity here? Because it does seem like that's being pitched as kind of a key advantage to this transition and green recovery.
That's a good question, Michael. I think Hindou would appreciate this, because even though I am working on a IPP, it's a 50 megawatt project, the community that we are working with regards to our corporate development plan and our social obligations actually is a very poor community that's mostly indentured. It's indentured servitude essentially to local landowners or business owners. So a lot of the refocus from the project company has been to educate and enable them using the site as a launching pad. We are very fortunate, as I said, that we do have mangroves, and we have a very rich site where local community goes fishing. They have we have crabbing on the site. So we are constantly having to interact with the local community. What we've done with them is that we've aligned their interests with the project company and focused them more on the protection of mangroves in particular.
Kumayl, I'm afraid we've lost you. It looks like you're muted.
I've got you on double speaker, but that's working.
If you could mute one of them,
that.
I
was dialing on my phone, but it's been an interesting alignment of our local communities, and we've worked very hard with the local communities, with the forestry departments, CDC support, of course, to have them recognize the fact that there's a longer term benefit for adopting environmental awareness. It has required the support of government entities, etc. But we're seeing the effect of that already on the site with the significant growth of mangroves, increase of wildlife on the site, and hence increase of livelihood and benefits to the communities. So that plan, and I think the benefit we've had is that because our partners have recognized that these are decisions and strategies that we take every day. So the plan has been molding as the project has been built and as we see the site settle over a period of time.
Great, thank you. So Hindou, a similar question. What do you think would be needed for the communities where you're working to see this transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy, or from carbon intensive infrastructure to low carbon infrastructure, just greener growth trajectories? What would it take for these communities to see that as an employment opportunity, a livelihood opportunity, as opposed to just something that's happening to them, as you've sort of said before? What's needed to build that sense of opportunity among people who could benefit most from it?
I think from indigenous communities, many of us, we do not already have this opportunity. There is no electricity in many of our lands. So when there is no access to the energy, so there is no access to the market or hospital or any other infrastructure. So in these communities, it will be an opportunity to build a different pathway of development. to do not follow the same that's happened, who put us in the climate change or environment degradations. So to use all the renewable or the greeners as much as possible job that we created. The rural areas are based on more than 70 to 80% of the global economy of our countries. So if we invest on the agroecology, I think Amal-Lee said also earlier in her speech. So we can invest in a land restorations, in a food system, smallholder farmers. So that will be the right transitions for the communities to create jobs, to create economy, but to protect the environment. The big issue on the just transition is in developed countries, in the big industry. So that's also make all the definition or all the understanding very packet in the small box. So they say like, oh, just a transition because people losing them job. So we need to go smoothly. Of course, yes, we need to go smoothly. But until when we have to go smoothly? We need to change just radically to take those peoples and train them, because we do have brains. We are very intelligent as human beings. Train them and shift them from the coal power to the renewable energy industry. That can help. Then it can work also very easily. And for those who do not have the job, so to do not just encourage them to go to the mining, so encourage them to go and do the individual business who can be just in agronomy. Let me give you the example. When we have the COVID, all the countries decided to lock down the countries, close the border. The only one thing from developed and developing countries agree on it, it's just leaving the shipping of food. Everyone say, I close my border. But if there is a plan or if there is a car or whatever, who's shipping the food from one border to another one, they are the only one who allow it to pass. So we understand that we are depending from each other. If we know we're depending from that, so why we cannot just to say it is possible to shift and shift very radically? It is the issue of priority. Now we are working across internet, I don't know how many thousands of miles across all of us. We are doing that is work. Because we're supposed to meet physically, we couldn't do that. So we need to put the priority. The work that we can do by far, we can do it by far. The work that necessary need the peoples to be there physically, they can be physically. And then that can help to restore our environment. It is a big opportunity of thinking that we have now. And our communities do that very well. So we need to learn from how it's work. We living without electricity, with lack of the food. But do you remember in DC or I don't know, in New York, when just so they didn't find the food in the supermarket, it's become a political issue. So it's like really a big political issue. I'm like, well, you are just living a 1 second of our daily life, because we know how to live without the lack of the food. So that's things we need to learn from it, build our sustainable future. So this is the transitions. And this is the just transition to give everyone the equity and everyone the access in the fair way.
Thank you, Hindou. I really couldn't think of a better note to end on. So I appreciate you giving us the final word there. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but this has been a really fantastic discussion. I've learned a lot and benefited a lot from it. Can I ask our team to bring up the illustration that was put together while this was going on? We'll take a quick look at that just sort of while I wrap everything up here. I want to just end by thanking our speakers, Amar, Amal-Lee, Hindou, and Kumayl. Thank you all. I think you brought really fascinating perspectives to this conversation. We will be sharing a recording of the webinar as well as a copy of this illustration with everyone who's joined today. So you'll have a chance to revisit that and spend more time with this graphic representation of our conversation, which frankly blows my mind. I don't know how people do this, but I think it's really fantastic and a nice way to sort of have this put into a different way of thinking. So make sure, please, to sign up for the last event in this series. The series is Building Resilience in Times of Disruption. The next event will focus on how to support women's economic empowerment post-COVID-19. and that's taking place on Wednesday, July 15th. Look out for more information on that. Again, I'm Michael Igo, senior reporter with DevEx. It's been my absolute pleasure to moderate this discussion this morning. And thank you all so much for joining us.